The land keeps secrets that time cannot erase. In the rolling hills of eastern Tennessee, where century-old oak trees whisper stories to the wind and red clay clings to roots like someone clinging to life itself, there exists a small town called Silent Valley, a name that for decades seemed like a fulfilled prophecy, because no one there spoke about what really happened 28 years ago. No one mentioned the name of Andrew Hayes, the young farmer who died under strange circumstances while working on the construction of the dam that promised to bring prosperity to the region. Margaret Hayes, his mother, a woman of 75 with hands weathered by work and a heart that never stopped seeking answers, had learned to live with silence. She had learned to wake each morning without her son, to work her small plot of land without his help, to celebrate family gatherings with his absence like an invisible guest everyone ignored. But there are truths the land cannot bury forever. There are secrets that wait for the precise moment to emerge, like seeds that germinate after years of drought. When the torrential rains of that autumn transformed the hills into rivers of mud and stone, when the earth opened revealing its hidden depths, no one imagined that along with the debris and pain would also come the truth. A truth as devastating as it was liberating, as painful as it was necessary. This is the story of a woman who lost her son twice, first to death, and then to the lies that surrounded it. But it is also the story of how justice, though it arrives late, always finds its way. Join us in this tale that speaks of dignity, of memory, and of the power a mother has when she decides that silence has lasted long enough. Leave us your comment about how you face life's injustices and what it means to you to fight for the truth, even when everyone asks you to let it go. The October sun fell gently over Silent Valley, that Tennessee town where white farmhouses clung to the hillside like barnacles to rock. Gravel roads wound between structures that had seen generations pass, and on every porch, autumn mums bloomed in clay pots that the grandmothers watered faithfully each evening. Margaret Hayes was in her small vegetable garden, pulling weeds that grew among the tomatoes. Her hands, gnarled by arthritis but still strong, worked the soil with that familiarity that only 75 years of life in the same place can give. The wind carried the scent of wild honeysuckle and the distant sound of the church bells announcing 6 in the evening. "Grandma Maggie." The high-pitched voice of Danny broke the quiet. The boy came running down the dirt path, his sneakers kicking up small clouds of reddish dust. He was carrying something in his hands, something that gleamed in the sun. "Look what I found near the ravine," he said breathlessly, extending a small tarnished medal. "It has letters engraved on it." Maggie wiped her hands on her apron and took the object. It was a St. Christopher medal, the patron of travelers. Her heart stopped for an instant when she recognized the initials on the back. A.H. Andrew Hayes. The same medal she had given her son the day he left to work on the construction of the Copper Creek Dam. "Are you okay, Grandma Maggie?" asked Danny, noticing how the color left the old woman's face. "Yes, sweetheart," Maggie lied, closing her fingers around the medal. "It's just that. This medal brings back memories." For 28 years, Maggie had lived with the official version. Andrew died in a workplace accident, a fall from scaffolding. They gave her a box with his personal belongings, but this medal was never among them. They told her it was an oversight, that safety regulations weren't followed, that it was a tragedy but no one was directly to blame. A modest financial compensation, a rushed funeral, and the implicit advice not to ask uncomfortable questions. "Was it from great-grandpa Andrew?" asked Danny. The boy never knew his great-grandfather, but he had heard fragmented stories, always told halfway, always interrupted when they became too specific. "Yes," Maggie answered, her voice barely a whisper. "Where exactly did you find it?" "Near the old ravine, where the rains made that big landslide. There's a lot of stuff coming out of the ground. Stones, old wood, even pieces of metal. The rains. The damned torrential rains of recent weeks had been the worst in decades. The ravine north of town, which for years had been just wasteland covered with brush, had partially collapsed, revealing layers of earth and debris that had been buried since they built the dam." Maggie looked toward the hills where the Copper Creek Dam rose, that concrete structure that had forever changed the landscape and lives of the valley. They had built it with promises of progress, water for irrigation, electricity, employment. And yes, it had brought some of those things. But it had also brought death, secrets, and a silence that weighed on the town like an invisible tombstone. "Take me there," Maggie said suddenly, removing her apron. I want to see that place. But Grandma, the path is rough, all muddy and... I've walked these hills since before your grandpa was born, Danny. I can walk a little more. The boy knew that tone. It was the same one she used when she had made a decision and nothing would make her change her mind. He took his great-grandmother's wrinkled hand and together they set out toward the ravine. The town stretched peaceful behind them. Earl Thompson, the oldest neighbor in the place, saw them pass from his porch and raised his hand in greeting. Maggie responded with a gesture but didn't stop. There was something in her chest, an urgency she hadn't felt in years, an inner voice telling her that after almost 3 decades, maybe, just maybe, it was time for the earth to reveal what it had kept for so long. The walk to the ravine took 20 minutes. For Maggie, they were 20 minutes of memories that assaulted her with each step. She remembered Andrew as a boy, running through these same paths. She remembered the day he told her he had gotten work on the dam construction, how his eyes shone with plans for the future. She remembered their last meal together, how he had insisted everything would be fine, that it was just temporary work, that he would soon return with enough money to buy more land, maybe a small tractor. She remembered the night 2 men in cheap suits knocked on her door to inform her that her son had died. She remembered how they wouldn't let her see the body, claiming the injuries were too severe. She remembered the funeral with a closed casket, the evasive looks from the other workers who attended, the uncomfortable silence that followed for years. Here it is, Grandma, Danny announced, pulling her from her thoughts. The ravine was a spectacle of contained destruction. The rains had eroded the hillside, creating a deep wound in the earth that revealed layers from different eras. There were ancient stones, possibly from structures that once occupied these valleys. There were fragments of pottery, pieces of rusted metal, rotted wood that crumbled to the touch. And there was something else. Something that made Maggie's heart beat so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Protruding from the mud, partially buried but visible, was a metal box. The kind used to store tools or important documents. It was rusted, covered with dirt, but the metal corners reflected the afternoon sun like distress signals sent through time. "Help me down," Maggie told her great-grandson, her voice trembling with an emotion she didn't know whether was hope or fear. "Grandma, it's slippery, you could... help me." With Danny holding her arm, Maggie carefully descended the muddy slope. Each step was a negotiation between her determination and her arthritic knees. But she made it. She knelt in the mud without caring about her Sunday dress, without caring about the dampness that soaked through to her old bones, and began to dig around the box with her own hands. Danny joined her, his young hands working faster, removing layers of compacted earth and small stones. Together, great-grandmother and great-grandson, they freed the box from its nearly 3-decade prison. It was heavier than it looked. Maggie lifted it with effort, feeling she was lifting not just metal but the weight of all those years of doubt, of unanswered questions, of sleepless nights wondering what really happened to her son. The latch was rusted but intact. She forced it with a stone until it gave way with a metallic click that sounded like the shot that starts a race. When she opened the lid, the air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Inside were documents, letters, photographs, all protected by a thick plastic bag that had kept moisture away. And there, on the first page of a notebook with worn leather covers, she recognized her son's handwriting. The handwriting she had seen on grocery lists, on birthday cards, in the only letter Andrew had sent her from the construction camp. Maggie's hands trembled so much she could barely hold the notebook. Tears began to fall before she read the first word, as if her body knew, before her mind did, that what she was about to discover would change everything. "Mom," the first entry in the notebook began, "if you're reading this, it means what I feared happened. It means they silenced me before I could speak. But the words I write here cannot be silenced. The truth cannot be buried forever." The sun was beginning to set when Maggie and Danny returned to town. They walked slowly, the old woman clutching the metal box against her chest as if it were a newborn baby. Her dress was ruined with mud, she had dirt under her nails and in her hair, but in her eyes there was something that hadn't been there in years: purpose. Earl Thompson was still on his porch, as if he hadn't moved in the 2 hours they had been gone. When he saw Maggie with the box, something changed in his expression. It was fear. Recognition. The face of someone seeing a ghost they believed buried forever. "Maggie," He called in a grave voice. "What are you carrying there?" "The truth, Earl," she replied without stopping. "The truth that all of you helped bury." The old man said nothing more. He just lowered his gaze, and in that gesture Maggie had confirmation of something she had suspected for years. It wasn't just she who lost her son. It was the whole town that lost its innocence, its integrity, the day they decided to accept the official version without asking uncomfortable questions. Once home, Maggie sent Danny off with a kiss on the forehead and the promise that everything would be fine. The boy went to his house with his mother, Maggie's granddaughter, but not without looking back several times, feeling that something important was about to happen. Alone in her small kitchen, with a cup of tea that cooled without her touching it, Maggie opened the box again and began to read. There was no hurry. After 28 years, a few more hours wouldn't make a difference. But she needed to understand everything, every detail, every word her son had left as a testament to his courage. The notebook told a story that was both simple and complex. Andrew had been hired as a construction assistant on the Copper Creek Dam. It was hard work but well paid, and for a young farmer with dreams of the future, it was an opportunity he couldn't refuse. The first weeks were normal. Work, fatigue, camaraderie with other workers, some jokes at the end of the day. But then he began to notice strange things. The concrete that arrived at the site didn't match the project specifications. It was lower quality, cheaper. The responsible engineers knew it and turned a blind eye. There were bribes, falsified documentation, inspections that were never carried out or that were approved in exchange for money under the table. "I watched them mix river sand with the concrete to save on cement," Andrew wrote in an entry dated 2 months before his death. "I asked the foreman and he told me to shut up if I wanted to keep working. But Mom, you taught me that a man must live with honor. How can I stay silent knowing this dam could fail someday? How many lives would my silence cost?" Maggie had to stop, tears blurring her vision. Her son. Her Andrew. He had been so noble, so foolishly brave. Of course he hadn't stayed quiet. Of course he had tried to do the right thing, even though the whole world told him it wasn't worth it. The following pages meticulously documented each irregularity Andrew had observed. He had dates, names of supervisors, technical descriptions copied from official documents that he then compared with what was actually being done on site. He had tried to report it to local authorities, but his complaint was never processed. He had tried to speak with the chief engineer, who threatened to fire him and make sure he never worked in the region again. "I'm scared, Mom," he confessed in one of the last entries. "But I'm more scared of staying silent. I hired a lawyer in the neighboring town. I gave him copies of all this. If anything happens to me, he'll know what to do. And I buried this box near the North Ravine, where I used to play as a child. Someday, if necessary, someone will find it." The last entry was dated 2 days before his death. "Tomorrow I have a meeting with a public works inspector who came from Nashville. They say he's honest, that he can't be bought. I'm going to show him everything. After tomorrow, this will be over one way or another. I love you, Mom. Forgive me if my honor costs you your son." Maggie closed the notebook and sobbed as she hadn't since the funeral. Now she understood. Her son hadn't died in an accident. They had killed him. They had silenced him because he dared to stand up for what was right, because he chose truth over safety, honor over money. For 28 years she had lived with doubt, with the feeling that something didn't add up in the official story. And she was right. Her mother's instinct had never lied to her. But along with the pain came something else. Rage. A cold, determined rage that gave strength to her tired body. Not only had they taken her son from her, they had stolen the truth, the right to know, the opportunity to seek justice. And everyone in town knew it, or at least suspected it, but no one had said anything. Out of fear, out of convenience, out of collective cowardice. That night, Maggie didn't sleep. She read every page of the notebook several times, memorizing details, understanding the scope of what her son had discovered. There were photographs of problematic areas of the construction. There were copies of contracts where the materials requested didn't match those delivered. There was a list of names. Businessmen, officials, engineers, all accomplices in a fraud that had put at risk the lives of thousands of people living downstream from the dam. When the sun rose the next day, Maggie was sitting at her kitchen table with a determination she hadn't felt in years. She was 75 years old, tired, her body aching from the previous day's excursion. But she had something more valuable than youth. She had the truth. And with the truth came the responsibility to do something with it. She dressed in her best clothes, those she reserved for Sunday services. She pulled her gray hair into a neat bun. She carefully stored the notebook and documents in a cloth bag. And she left her house with her head held high, ready to do what her son hadn't been able to finish. Her first destination was Earl Thompson's house. The old man saw her coming from his porch, and something in his face told him he couldn't avoid this conversation. "Earl," Maggie said without preamble, "I need you to tell me something, and I need you to be honest for the first time in 28 years. What do you know about my son's death?" The old man took a deep breath, his hands trembling on his cane. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "I worked on that dam, Maggie. I was safety supervisor. I saw what your son saw. But I had a family to feed, debts to pay. When they offered me money to falsify some reports, God forgive me, I accepted. Did you know they were going to kill him? No. I swear on my grandchildren I didn't. But when he died, I knew it wasn't an accident. We all knew. And we all kept silent because they threatened us, because we were afraid, because we were cowards." Tears ran down the old man's wrinkled face. "I've lived 28 years with this shame, Maggie. 28 years without being able to look you in the eye." Maggie felt compassion for the old man, but this wasn't the time for consolation. Who gave the order? Who is responsible? The chief engineer was a man named Robert Callahan. He worked for the construction company Morrison and Associates. But there were politicians involved, powerful people from the state capital. Your son discovered something bigger than he imagined. Where is this Callahan now? He prospered, Maggie. Got rich. Now he's a private consultant, has offices in Nashville. Morrison and Associates is still operating, building bridges and dams all over the state. Nobody paid for what they did. Maggie nodded slowly. Until now, Earl. Until now. The office of Silent Valley's town hall smelled of old paper and reheated coffee. The mayor, a middle-aged man named William Crawford, looked up from his desk when Maggie entered unannounced, with the cloth bag under her arm and an expression that admitted no refusals. "Mrs. Hayes, if you need any documents or—" "I didn't come for documents," she interrupted, placing the bag on the desk. "I came to deliver evidence of a crime that has remained unpunished for 28 years. Evidence that proves my son Andrew Hayes was murdered because he tried to report fraud and corruption in the construction of Copper Creek Dam." The mayor paled. "Ma'am, those are very serious accusations." "They're not accusations. They're facts documented by my son before he died." Maggie took out the notebook and opened it. "Here are the names, the dates, the irregularities. And I need you to immediately contact the competent authorities to reopen the case." William Crawford leafed through the notebook with trembling hands. As he read, his expression went from skepticism to shock. If this is true, the implications are enormous. The dam has been in operation for almost 3 decades. Thousands of people live in the risk zone. If the construction was defective, then my son's life was lost trying to prevent a tragedy that could still happen, Maggie completed. That's why I need you to act now. Not in a few days, not after consultations. No. The mayor nodded, picking up the phone. Over the next few hours, the small town hall office became a hive of activity. Public works inspectors arrived from the state capitol. The county sheriff arrived to take statements. Journalists arrived who had heard rumors of an explosive story. Maggie told her story over and over. She showed the documents, explained how she had found them, answered every question with the patience of someone who had waited almost 3 decades for this moment. Some looked at her with pity, like an old woman clinging to conspiracy theories. But others, especially the engineers who reviewed Andrew's technical notes, looked at her with growing alarm. Now, before we continue, tell us if you're enjoying this story. Remember to leave a like, support our work by subscribing to the channel, and activate notifications to receive alerts when we publish new videos. Leave your comment below to give us your opinion on the topic discussed. Stay with us and discover the surprising ending that awaits us. These observations are accurate, said one of the engineers, a young man with glasses and a serious expression. If what he describes here is true, there are sections of the dam that could have structural cracks. With increasingly intense rains from climate change, the risk of collapse. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood the implications. The news spread through Silent Valley like wildfire through dry grass. Neighbors gathered in groups, whispering, looking toward the dam in the distance with new apprehension. Some defended Maggie, saying they had always suspected something dark surrounded Andrew's death. Others, especially those who had worked on the construction, kept an uncomfortable silence, feeling the weight of their complicity. That afternoon, Maggie received an unexpected visit. A man in an expensive suit got out of a black car with Nashville plates. He identified himself as a lawyer for Morrison and Associates. His smile was professional, but his eyes were cold. "Mrs. Hayes, I've come to make you a reasonable proposal," he began. "My client is willing to offer you generous compensation for the troubles you suffered so many years ago. A considerable sum that would allow you to live your last years in comfort. In exchange, we only need you to sign a confidentiality agreement and withdraw these unfounded accusations." Maggie looked at him the way one looks at a particularly repulsive insect. "Unfounded? My son documented every irregularity. He died defending the truth. And you come to offer me money so I'll shut up like everyone shut up 28 years ago? Ma'am, be reasonable. Your son died almost 3 decades ago. Nothing you do will bring him back. But with this money you could." "I could what? Buy peace of conscience? Betray my son's memory?" Maggie stood up, pointing at the door. "Get out of my house. And tell your bosses they can't buy me. That the truth isn't for sale." The lawyer hardened his expression. "You're making a mistake, ma'am. You're messing with very powerful people. For your own good. Are you threatening her?" Earl Thompson's voice sounded from the doorway. The old man had arrived without anyone noticing, leaning on his cane but with his back straighter than it had been in years. "Because if you're threatening this woman, you'd better leave before I call the sheriff myself." Behind Earl appeared more neighbors. Danny with his mother. The bakery owner. The school teacher. People who had known Andrew, who had grown up with him, who had attended his funeral and kept silent too long. The lawyer looked around, assessing the situation. He was outnumbered and clearly uncomfortable. "This isn't over," he muttered before leaving. When he was gone, Maggie sank into her chair, suddenly exhausted. Earl approached and put a hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone in this, Maggie. We should have supported you 28 years ago. But we'll support you now." The neighbors nodded. One by one, they began to share their own suspicions, their own fragments of truth they had kept out of fear or shame. A mosaic of complicity began to take shape, revealing not just a crime but a complete structure of corruption that had infected the entire project. That night, while Danny slept in the adjoining room and the house fell silent, Maggie opened her son's notebook again. She read it not with pain this time, but with pride. Andrew had been brave when others were cowards. He had stood up for what was right when it was easier to look the other way. He had died young, but he had died with honor. "You didn't die in vain, son," she whispered to the notebook. "I promise you." 2 months later, the investigation commission delivered its preliminary report. It was devastating. Andrew's notes had guided inspectors to the problematic sections of the dam. Using modern technology, they had discovered multiple cracks in the structure, some superficial, others worryingly deep. The concrete in several critical sectors didn't meet specifications. The dam was, in the words of the chief engineer of the investigation, a disaster waiting to happen. Partial draining of the reservoir was ordered while emergency repairs were made. Thousands of people downstream were temporarily evacuated. National media covered the story extensively. The elderly woman from Silent Valley who had unraveled a corruption scandal and saved lives became national news. But Maggie didn't want to be famous. She wanted justice. The criminal case was formally opened. Robert Callahan, the chief engineer, was arrested in his Nashville office. Other officials followed: the director of the construction company, 3 politicians who had received bribes, several inspectors who had falsified reports. The corruption network was more extensive than anyone imagined. At the trial, which was held in the state capitol with enormous media coverage, Maggie testified. She carried Andrew's notebook as if it were a sacred relic. With a firm voice despite her 75 years, she told the whole story. Not just the story of corruption and fraud, but the story of a son who loved his mother enough to write her the truth before dying. The story of a young man who chose honor over life itself. There wasn't a dry eye in the room when she finished speaking. Defense attorneys tried to discredit the evidence, claiming the notebook could be forged, that too many years had passed to prove anything with certainty. But forensic engineers had their own evidence. The cracks in the dam, the analysis of the concrete, documents from that time showing discrepancies between materials ordered and delivered. Everything matched what Andrew had documented. The verdict came after 3 weeks of deliberations. Guilty. All of them. Prison sentences, million-dollar fines, permanent bans from working on public projects. Morrison and Associates was dissolved, its assets seized to pay reparations. But more important to Maggie than the sentences was official recognition. The judge, in his final ruling, declared that Andrew Hayes had been murdered for defending the integrity of a public work and protecting innocent lives. His death was officially catalogued as homicide in defense of public interest. A formal apology from the state government was ordered and a special pension for his family as recognition of his sacrifice. The afternoon the verdict was announced, Silent Valley organized a ceremony in the town square. They erected a small but dignified monument, a bronze plaque with Andrew Hayes' name and the words he died defending the truth. Maggie stood before the monument, with Danny by her side, surrounded by neighbors who now looked at her not with pity but with respect. The mayor handed her the symbolic keys to the town, a recognition she accepted with grace. "I didn't do this for recognition," Maggie said when they passed her the microphone. "I did it because my son deserves to have his name remembered with honor, not with whispers and shame. I did it because the truth, though it hurts, is always better than the most comfortable lie." She paused, her eyes scanning the faces of neighbors who had been part of her life for decades. For 28 years, this town kept silent, not just about my son but about its own complicity. But today, by facing that truth, by acknowledging that mistake, this town recovers its dignity. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it allows us to build a different future. She looked at Earl Thompson, who stood in the crowd with tears in his eyes. She gave him a nod. The old man had testified at the trial, confessing his participation in falsifying reports. His testimony had been crucial to building the case. He would face minor legal consequences, but he had recovered something more valuable: his integrity. After the ceremony, as the sun set over the Tennessee hills painting the sky orange and purple, Maggie walked to the cemetery on the outskirts of town. Andrew's grave now had a new headstone, paid for with part of the government's compensation. It no longer said just his name and dates. Now it included an inscription: "Hero who gave his life defending the truth. His courage saved countless lives." Maggie knelt with difficulty in front of the grave and placed a bouquet of wildflowers, the same ones that grew on the hills where Andrew played as a child. "I did it, son. The truth came to light. Your name is clear. And the dam is being repaired, so no family will have to suffer what we suffered." She felt a small hand on her shoulder. Danny had approached silently. "Do you think Great-Grandpa Andrew is watching us, Grandma Maggie?" Maggie smiled through her tears. "I'm sure of it, sweetheart. And I think he's proud. Not just of what we did, but of what you'll do when you grow up. Because now you know his story. You know that in your family runs the blood of heroes. Blood of people who stand up for what's right even if it costs everything. When I grow up," Danny said with the seriousness only children can have, "I'm going to be like him. I'm going to be brave and honest. I know you will, my love. I know you will." Together, great-grandmother and great-grandson, they stayed a moment longer before the grave as the sun finished setting. Then they walked back to town, hand in hand, carrying with them not the weight of pain but the lightness that comes with truth finally revealed. The land had kept its secrets for 28 years. But the land, like truth, cannot keep buried forever what must come to light. And when it finally emerges, though it brings pain, it also brings something more precious. Justice, dignity, and the peace that comes from knowing the memory of the one you loved is clean and honored. Dear friends, the story of Maggie and Andrew teaches us that truth never dies. It only waits for the right moment to emerge. There are battles that aren't won immediately, but that doesn't mean they're not worth fighting. Sometimes justice arrives late, but when it does, it honors not only those who suffered injustice, but those who had the courage not to give up in their search. Andrew died young, but he died with honor. His mother lived almost 3 decades with an open wound, but never stopped seeking answers. And when the earth finally revealed its secrets, she had the courage to confront the powerful and demand justice. She shows us that age doesn't define our capacity to fight, that it's never too late to stand up for what's right, that a single voice speaking truth can change the course of history. May this story remind us to defend truth in our own lives, even when it's uncomfortable. May it inspire us to be like Andrew when we face moral dilemmas. And may it give us Maggie's courage to never stop seeking justice, no matter how long it takes. The land keeps secrets, but truth always finds its way to the light. And when it does, it heals wounds that seemed impossible to close.